Okay, I'm getting the recording going.
You give your speech
Speech
about the recording.
Oh, right. So it says we're live on YouTube. We're not actually live. It's unlisted. We record it and then put it up later. And we already have recordings of day 1 and day 2 up on the Gebser.org website. Just go to the Cosmo local conference page and scroll down to the schedule. So under day 1, there's a link for day 1's recordings, and under day 2's recordings, and then we'll get these up from today as quickly as possible. And Jeremy has just put the link into chat, so feel free to copy it there. Welcome everybody to the third and final day of the International Jean Gebser Society Conference. We're really happy to have everybody here again. Lots of familiar faces by now. So today, the schedule that you might see online or got in the email is going to be mostly the same, but we're going to have to flow with some reschedulings. But we'll get started with Dave Zuckerman first. Dave is a professor at Sacramento State University in communications, I believe. But he is also bringing Gebser to the prison system in California. And he is coming to us from inside the prison. Fulsom prison, the one Johnny Cash sang about, yes. I'll let him share about the background behind him, and welcome, Dave. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody near and far. Those of us on the West Coast, thank you for being up so early. So I am, in fact, coming to you from inside Folsom State Prison, where I spend at least one day every week. My background is a shot I took of the prison. It's, and I'm going to talk about this in my presentation. This is a place of immense contradictions. That it's, if you can see behind me, the building itself is beautiful. There's a herd of deep.
Did we lose Dave?
Yeah, I think so.
Dave, can you hear us? Because we can't hear you.
Lost the feed.
Huh. It looks like his internet went out. Anyhow, he was telling us that that herd of deer lives there full time. The prison was built in the late 1800s by mostly Chinese prisoners who were literally chained to the building as they were building it. So they'd get, a layer of stones laid, and then they'd have to, like build a scaffolding to chain the prisoners to the next layer so they could lay them. It was really kind of weird. Jeremy, while we're waiting for Dave to come back online, do you have any announcements?
Just that this afternoon, we're going to be having another Cosmo Local series of events. Oh, is Dave back?
I'm back.
Oh, you're back. Okay, I'll announce that later, but it's on. It was in the email anyway. We're gonna have Sam Hines talking about communal revelry later.
Cool. I apologize for that. when you're in a prison, you have to be flexible, and sometimes the internet disappears. I was in the middle of a sentence, but anyway, I'm here a couple times a week, and well, let me just get into it because my time is already clicking. So, in honor of the wonderful, beautiful, fantastic rain that we're getting in the West, I chose a backdrop with raindrops on it. So there's nothing wrong with your monitor. I have been very, very fortunate in my career. And those of you who have gotten to know me over the years at Gebser Conferences know that I tend to be less of a theoretician with Gebser, and I try to be more of an applied kind of researcher. And so I've done Gebser stuff with folks in post-war Afghanistan, if such a thing exists, in Northern Ireland, in China, with departing exchange students leaving China for the first time. I've always tried to bring Gebser in a practical way to address practical concerns. And while I have a tremendous respect for the theoreticians, I find that my own work tends to be more of an applied kind of approach to Gebser. And so for the last couple of semesters, I have been in the leadership of a marvelous program that my university has created. And it's a degree completion program in 2 state prisons. Fulsom Prison, where I am right now, and Mule Creek State Prison, which is about 45 minutes drive from Sacramento. And this program is for incarcerated people, men, because these are male prisons, men's prisons, incarcerated men who have some college credits to earn a bachelor's degree in communication. And that is extremely significant historically in the prison system here in California, because it's only recently that we can say that there are educational programs in every state prison in California. That's a recent statement, and that change to the prison system vis-a-vis education came with a lot of kicking and screaming from a lot of folks. But at this point, we have programs of some sort in all 35 California state prisons. Most of those programs address the critical lack of education on the part of the incarcerated people. And so most of the educational programs that these guys get, men and women in the women's prisons, is a high school diploma or a GED. There are some community colleges that operate. There are about 25 community colleges that operate up and down the state, but for the most part, they operate through a correspondence model. And so the students would get a packet in the mail, and it's kind of a self-guided thing, and they write their stuff in longhand on sheets of paper, and they put it in an envelope and send it to the professor. What Sacramento State is doing, and unconnected to us, what Cal State Los Angeles is doing, is something revolutionary, which is that we're going into the prisons and teaching these folks inside the walls of the prisons. So our program is unique even amongst prison programs because we operate live classes simultaneously in 2 different prisons. And so our faculty are in a classroom here at Fulsom, live with a classroom full of incarcerated students. And we are also connected by Zoom to a classroom of students live in our other prison. So we use both the face-to-face modality and the online Zoom hybrid at the same time. And so what I want to talk to you about is the way that as the acting director of this program, I am bringing Gebserian thought into this prison program. So I'm calling this presentation Transforming Outcomes Project at Sacramento State, a story unfolding in 3 parts. So Transforming Outcomes Project at Sacramento State is the name of this program. We abbreviate it as TOPS. So the TOPS program stands for Transforming Outcomes Project at Sacramento State. And it's a story that's unfolding because the program is still new. We're only a year into it. So the story isn't written yet. We're writing it. And I'm going to tell part of it in 3 parts this morning. So part 1 is what's in a name. And there are 3 parts to each of my 3 parts. So I want to start with TOPS, with Jessica, and with students. So when I inherited the program, it was called the Opportunity Program at Sacramento State, TOPS. And we built some notoriety, some fame, and some brand equity with the name TOPS. But it was also a problem because there's a nationwide program called the Opportunity Program, which is in universities and community colleges all across the country. And there was some confusion and some toe stepping about the use of a name. And it had to change. We had to change the name. I'm brand new at the job. And one of the first things I had to do was change the name. And I really agonized and soul searched. And I thought about other names that really kind of embody what we ought to be and how we ought to be called and everything. But I realized that people don't really know what the name stands for, but they knew TOPS. I can walk into the prisons, I can pick up the phone and call headquarters, I can call across my university campus, and people know the word TOPS. So I had to kind of keep it. But I wanted it to be Gebserian in its orientation. I wanted it to really embody the values that we all believe are so important, and the worldview and the perspective that we all believe is so important. And so I renamed the program Transforming Outcomes Project at Sacramento State. And I want to break down each of those 3 words because I think they're really important, and I want to talk about why they're Gebserian. So transforming, the idea here is that we're trying to make a transformation. Now we know certain things. We know that recidivism rates drop when a person gets a bachelor's degree. We know that. That's an established fact. It's been studied for decades at this point. In fact, when someone gets a bachelor's degree in anything, the recidivism rate drops by 95%. That they have a 5% likelihood of recidivism after a bachelor's degree. That's an astounding statistic. By the way, when you get a postgraduate degree, that number drops to 0. So transforming is really what we're trying to do here. But I'm walking into an environment, the penal system, the carceral system, that has its own orientation and its own worldview and its own way of thinking and doing. And while the principal, whom some of you just met a few minutes ago, has been an incredible ally, absolutely supportive, some of the other people that I encounter in the prison system are much more resistant to something like this. One of the correctional officers actually said to me, "Oh, hey, if I murder somebody, can I get a free college degree too?" And so we're not just here delivering coursework. We're really trying to make transformation. And so I needed to put transforming in the name of the program so that everybody knows that that's what we're here to do. Funny story, I've been working with the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation since 2005. I was called in as a communication professor to teach some leadership courses to staff members. And I've been doing that since 2005, all up and down the state, been going into prisons, in and out of prisons for a long time now. When I first started, the department was called CDC, the California Department of Corrections. Shortly after I first came on board, they changed the name of the department to CDCR. They added rehabilitation. So I would be teaching these classes and they'd be filled with staff members, mostly correctional officers. And the sale of Sharpies went way up when they made this change, because the correctional officers would take a Sharpie and they cross the R off of their patch. And I was in a class once and the guy's doing that. I said, "What are you doing?" And he says, I'm removing the R. And I said, "Why?" And he says, "Because we don't do rehabilitation." And I said, "Well, what the hell do you think corrections means? They're synonyms. You know, that this is a process that these guys are engaged in." But in fact, to a lot of the people that I encounter, both inside prisons and outside prisons, these aren't facilities to do anything but warehouse. We're taking the bad people and we're putting them away. And that lock them up and throw away the key idea is prevalent. And it's prevalent on the streets, and it's prevalent even amongst a lot of people who work in the system. So counter to that is this tradition of the penitentiary and penitence. And there certainly is a Christian religious aspect to a lot of what happens in here. And it's funny how it trickles in. So we're under strict orders that we can never use profanity in the classroom. Meanwhile, I walk through the yard and I hear all kinds of profanity that I never even heard before in my life. But we're not allowed to use it because that would be counter to the program of that penitentiary. But CDCR has really started to work on rehabilitative programs, whether it's drug counseling or anger management or victim face-to-face with victims or educational programs. And so we're part of a change, but our program also has to be apart from the change and lead the change in a certain way. And so the idea of transformation, which is so, pardon the pun, integral to Gebserian thought, had to be integral to the name of the program, that it's about transformation, that we're transforming every student, we're transforming the institution, we're transforming education, because if this program succeeds, this becomes a model for other programs up and down the state and across the country. So transformation has to be the name of the game. And what are we transforming? We're transforming outcomes, both personal outcomes and shared outcomes inside the prison and outside the prison, because 92% of California's incarcerated folks are going to get out. And we want them to rejoin society in a way that's going to be beneficial to them and to everybody else. And so we care about these outcomes. And then I renamed it from a program to a project, because a project is something that's ongoing. A project is something that requires contribution and work, rather than a program, which sounds so administrative and soulless. That a project is something that happens in fits and starts. You fall down and you brush yourself off and you get back up and you keep working. So the name TOPS itself is more than just a moniker, it's an identity. And this was something that was really important to me as a leader and as a Gebserian, that we imbibe the program with these values. So another name is Jessica, and that's a pseudonym, but I have a student this semester who's a trans person, biologically male, gendered female in one of the prisons. And the prison system refuses to use the preferred name and pronouns of this student, and the prison system uses what's in the records, which causes all kinds of strife and consternation with the student. But it's the policy of our university to call students by the names and use the pronouns that they ask us to. And by simply engaging with this person in the way that she defines herself, we have been able to avoid all kinds of fights and drama and trouble that no one else can manage to avoid. And part of it is, again, I think it stems from this idea of just human understanding, speaking to this person in the terms that she requests. And then the last name that's really important is students. We call our students students. The rest of this institution calls them inmates, which is a word that we bar in our training. These are students. I don't know what they did to get in here. I don't know what offenses they committed. I don't know how long their sentences are. I never ask. And when they start to tell me, I ask them not to tell me. Because from my perspective, they're students. And it's kind of gimmicky. But I was having a conference with two of them after class this past Thursday. And one of them said to me, out of the blue, "You are the only people who don't call us inmates. And that allows us to become students." Those are his words. He's been in prison, by the way, for 22 years. I don't know why. But by just calling them students instead of inmates, he said that allows them to become students. This idea of transformation and of a holistic way of interacting with people can start with a simple term. So what's in a name? Part two, what are we doing here? So the three parts of this one are Frere, Gebser, and me. So I'm not a scholar of education. I'm a scholar of communication. I'm actually a scholar of terrorism. So I'm really on the big outskirts of my lane doing this program. But I do know the work of Paulo Freire, and I hope that many of you do as well. And if you don't, you should. Freire was a Brazilian education reformer, and he wrote in beautiful Portuguese, which is translated into very clunky English, about this process that he calls conscientization. He called it conscientization. But this idea of conscientization, that we have to really rethink the educational process and who we are involved as people involved with it. And he railed against what he called the banking system, which is where you believe that you are a full pitcher and your student is an empty glass. And you're going to fill that student with your material, with your knowledge, because they have none and you have all of it. And he looked at the messed up power dynamics that are involved with that, the presumptions that we make about students not knowing anything, but also the very basic transactional, what he called banking model of this. You give me money, I give you knowledge. You sit quietly, I talk. And he said, this is not learning. This is not education. This is another form of subjugation. I believe that Freire really speaks in a language that dovetails quite well with Gebser. And I've been a professor for 25 years now, and I know that I'm a better professor because of my understanding both of Freire and of Gebser. And coming into this environment where most of what they got was correspondence model education, I've had to really shake things up. So on Thursday, I was talking about an interpersonal conflict. I showed a little video in class, and it was two 20-something girl roommates who were arguing about where a chair goes in their living room. And it was a staged video for a textbook. And so it showed the bad way to interact and then the good way to interact, right? So first they fought over this chair, and then now let's see how they should have done it. And then they act completely unnaturally, totally differently, and everything's harmonious. So I showed this video, and then I asked the students about it. And deliberately, to provoke a conversation, I said that this one young woman in this video is really a psycho about this chair, which spurred a 25-minute conversation about something that I hadn't anticipated. So when I talk about relational communication to my typical undergraduates, it always goes to romance. because that's where the typical 22-year-old mind is. Romantic relationships, dating. I'm talking about this video and relational communication to these students. And the one says, I've been in prison for 40 years. I live in a 9x7 concrete cell with another grown man. It's not psycho to argue over where a box of books goes. And we had this whole conversation. And in that conversation, I had to just stop being the font of knowledge, and I had to just listen and learn. Because though I'm in prisons a lot, I get to go home. You know, the joke for me never gets old. Every time I leave a prison, I call my wife and I say, against everyone's better judgment, they let me out of prison and I'm on my way home. And I think that's hilarious. And I tell that joke twice a week, 3 times a week, 4 times a week. And she still acts like she's never heard it before. But I get to go home, and these incarcerated students don't. And though I may have felt cabin fever being stuck in a house with multiple children over the course of COVID, I don't live in a 9x7 concrete cell with another grown human. And so this is a great illustration of how my role as a professor is oftentimes to be a learner alongside my students. Without Freire's insight, I think that would be harder for me to grasp. And of course, Gebser, I want to draw back not only on the good work that Robert Mitchell has done with K through 12 education, and Bernie Neville in Australia has done with K through 12 education, but also to talk about something that Al just McCune said last week, which is that origin isn't something that we return to. Origin is ever present. Now, why am I bringing this up now? I'm bringing this up now because in the context of a rehabilitative program for people who are incarcerated in a state prison, origin has to always be there. So we had a conversation about parole boards, because part of my job is writing these letters that are called milestones letters that get put in these incarcerated people's permanent files. And those files go before the parole board and in front of the warden and everybody else. And I write these letters on letterhead that talk about how they've done in class and what courses they're taking and what grades they're getting and everything. And so the topic of parole boards came up. And of course, parole boards ask, basically, are you taking responsibility for what you did? And that's a hard question for a lot of these men to answer. It's a hard question to face our actions, especially actions that were grievous enough to land us in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years in state prison. And we had a conversation about parole boards, which morphed into a conversation about Gebser. Because I placed Gebser books. Jeremy was kind enough to donate copies of his books. Glenn Bricio Perry was kind enough to donate copies of his books. I donated copies of my Gebser intercultural book. One of the professors at CIIS, Sean Kelly, donated copies of his books. And so we put Gebser books in the prison libraries, and I brought Gebser into the classroom. And so this conversation about how do we approach the parole board became a conversation that the students were driving by using Gebser and by talking about origin and by talking about striving for integrality, which for a lot of them includes facing that person who they were, who brought them in here. So it was a mind-blowing conversation. And so what am I doing here? On the surface of it, I'm a university administrator, acting director of a program. I answer to the dean of undergraduate studies, who answers to the provost. It's pretty high on the food chain. And a lot of my job is, spreadsheets and budgets and applying for grants and normal college guys, administrator stuff. But a lot of my job is actually trying to change mindsets to create this transformation. And so that is a really unique position. And in a couple of weeks, I'm going to present, not this year I won't present, I will attend. Next year I'll present a Gebserian approach to prison education at a national conference for prison education. I'm not on the schedule this time around, but I'm sure as heck going to be on it next year because it's working. We can see it. I can see it in the students themselves and the conversations that they have even without me around. Part 3, because I want to pay attention to time. From recidivism to integrality. So I mentioned some of this already, that the data are stunning for recidivism. So a RAND study showed that within 3 years of release, the reoffending rate is somewhere around 76%. 76% of released former inmates will reoffend within 3 years. If they get a high school diploma, that number drops to 54%, 54.6%. If they get an associate's degree, which most of the college programs are associate's degrees, that drops to 13.7%, which is a wonderful number. If they get a bachelor's degree, that number drops to 5.6%. And if they get a master's degree or any other kind of postgraduate degree, that number drops to 0. So we know that recidivism is a big problem, and lowering recidivism needs to be a priority. In terms of dollars and cents, the California Legislative Analyst's Office says that it costs Californians, and there are several of us on here, $81,203 every year to incarcerate a single adult. $81,000 for one person. And since 2010, that number has increased by about 58%, largely because we were neglecting their medical and psychological and dental needs. And because of a lot of lawsuits, the state of California has had to address these needs, and that's driven up the cost of incarceration. But it's $81,000 a year for one person. We also know that every dollar spent in prison education saves the taxpayer between $3 and $5 within the first 3 years of post-incarceration. And that's largely because, in conjunction with new laws that bar discrimination against former inmates, a man or a woman getting out of prison with a degree of one kind or another that can lead to viable employment is going to take less from society and contribute more in terms of revenue. They're going to have a job, they're going to pay taxes, they're going to be less likely to be in and out of jail or on public assistance or back in prison. And so these programs really do pay for themselves, not just in the long run, but in the short term. But as I said at the outset of this presentation, there's a tremendous amount of resistance, both inside and outside the prisons. And so in a really Gebserian way, we need to move beyond sides. Just as the background behind me is absolutely breathtaking and stunning and beautiful, and yet it shows one of the most horrifying places on earth, which is a prison. We have to recognize the oxymorons, the contradictions. We have to recognize that it can be both beautiful and horrifying. It can be both renewing and a continuation of that which should be renewed. I can deliver education to a young man of 25 who will get out soon, and I can deliver the same education to a man of 65 who will never see the breathe free air or see the outside of this prison. We have to embrace those contradictions, and that to me is also a truly Gebserian way of seeing the world, moving beyond these binaries and recognizing that these wholes, WHOLES, are true. So that's my story, unfolding story in 3 parts. I wanted to tell you what I'm up to and how Gebser is making a difference. I'm going to conclude this with one last thought, which is right now it's 9:40 in the morning here in Fulsom. And in a couple hours, you're going to hear a poem written by one of the students in this program, who, after I mentioned Gebser and I talked about Jeremy's book, which I think is a marvelous, marvelous introduction to Gebser. And I talked about Ever-Present Origin. He had a family member buy it and send it to him, and he carries it around like a Bible. This incarcerated guy carrying around EPO, and like the rest of us, he has all these little tabs sticking out of it with this area or that area or this quote or that quote. And so he was courageous enough when he heard that Gebser was really into poetry and that poetry is a viable thing for this conference. He wrote a poem and he sent it off. So you're going to hear from him. He has a wonderful name, a name to match a wonderful smile. I'm going to ask him if he'll break the rules a little bit and take his mask off so you can see his wonderful smile. But his name is Michael Love. And so Mr. Love is going to share a poem, a love poem, with all of us in a couple hours. So that's how I spend my time. And I appreciate you giving me some of yours. And I'm happy to open it up for discussion, questions, browbeating, whatever you want.
Mike, you got a question?
Yeah, aren't some of these results you were talking about in the studies, this is not new, right?
Not new. Our program is new, but the study of prison education is new. The problem has been, it's a political hot potato. It's very frustrating to people that the cost of a college education gets beyond the reach of working class and many middle class families. And, behind bars, rapists and murderers are going to college. It's a hard sell for folks. And I understand that. But these programs in California are pretty new.
Dave, what's the typical class size or the class size that you have now?
I can hear somebody, but only barely.
This is Jeff. Can you hear me?
Jeff Keel.
Hey, Jeff, I can barely hear you.
Okay. Let's see if I can. How about this?
Oh, that's better.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. My question was, what is the typical class size that you've had so far in terms of participants?
So we are moving into our 3rd cohort. Our first cohort was 11.
Okay.
Our contract with the state of California is 50. It's capped at 50.
Mhm.
There is a budget shortfall. This is my administrator hat now, not my Gebserian hat. There's a budget shortfall because the federal grants, the Pell grants, don't cover, and I'm glad they don't. They don't cover all of the extra garbage that colleges and universities tack on above tuition. And I'm glad they don't, right? Because the university could charge $30,000 for all this stuff and the feds would be paying it. And that's a terrible use of money. The problem for me is that there's a budget shortfall of about $1,200 per capita. And so that ends up, this semester it's $38,000 I got to find. And the president of my university is so behind this that he came up with that money for this year. And he said, I'll pay for 40. So I haven't reached the 50 yet.
Mhm.
We went from 11. We currently have 27. We're going to have 40 in the spring.
Mhm.
Once I figure out a way, part of my job is writing grants and begging people for money. Once I find that, and I'm also in an effort with the legislature to get them to stop billing these incarcerated people for things they can't use. So we charge them $400 a semester to use the university union and the gym, which they can't, and $150 for counseling services, which they can't use. And, there's all these things that it's unjust that we're charging them for things that they can't possibly obtain, can't possibly use. So I'm spearheading an effort with the legislature. It's nice to be in Sacramento because it's just down the street from me, to try to get a carve out for these incarcerated students. But we will go from 11 to 27 to 40 students in just over a year. And each class, there are 2 cohorts right now with 27 in them, and 11 and 16 respectively. Each prison is about half and half. So a typical class has about 15, 16 guys in it.
Okay. And is there, with respect to Gebser, I'm curious, is there a particular part of his writings or aspect of his approach that they find most fascinating?
Yeah, they really liked, and by the way, I have to say this, I don't know if Jessie ever gets tired of it, but I show Jessie's marvelous, wonderful movies that she's made. I have to break the law a little bit because YouTube is off limits in prison. So I have to rip Jessie's movies. I should just ask Jessie to email them to me or something, but I have to rip them from YouTube and then save them on a computer so I can show them in class. But I do show them to the students, and they love them. The idea of consciousness, the idea of seeing themselves as manifestations of multiple structures of consciousness, thank you, Jessie, is revolutionary to them.
Mm.
They love that. I tried to talk with them about diaphaneity. They didn't quite get that wasn't, but they really loved that, the idea of this. And then when I talked about deficient and efficient modes, it was like their light bulbs went on. They really loved it.
Great. Thanks.
Yeah.
Wow. Dave, I don't really have a question, but I just want to thank you so much for the beautiful project you're doing. I mean, and for being you. Just I'm kind of gushing because, if you think about it, every human being has worth, every human being has dignity, and then we always look at like the tiny examples, like the Malcolm X, the Nelson Mandela, the Martin Luther King who wrote the letter in the Birmingham jail, but there's the possibility of any person doing great things, and no matter what situation they're in, and what you're doing and the way that you're doing it, the integrity that you hold as a human being yourself, and the way that you treat everybody with respect and only refer to them as students and don't care about their history. I just can't thank you enough. And I would like to come see it in person and come facilitate a dialogue or something one time, if that is possible. That's my only question.
It's I'll tell you, it's not impossible.
Okay.
To make it happen. And so, when that time comes, you let me know about a month in advance, and we'll do what we can to get you in. Misha asked a great question about what percentage of inmates have a college degree. And the answer in my program is, if we count associate's degree, which we certainly should, it's a college degree, most of mine come in with an associate degree or more, multiple, because these guys are in prison. It's boring in here. It's terrifying, and it's also boring, right? And so I have one student who has not one, not two, not even three. He has 4 associate's degrees. He can only transfer in 70 units from community college, and he's come in with like, I don't know, 265 or something. But they read. They're avid readers. The library here is terrible. And so Glenn, your contribution, Sean's contribution, Jeremy's contribution, putting books in here has made a tremendous difference because the library here is just awful. It's no surprise that prison library spending would be at the bottom of everybody's priority list. If you have any books that you'd like to donate, I'm happy to accept them. And then I would place them in the prison library as well, Gebserian or not. But I can tell you, Jeremy's book is hard to stay on the shelves. It's hard to keep it on the shelves, Jeremy. You've got a fan base here. So is there a plan to do this in women's prison? I would absolutely love to. There's a women's prison. Folsom's actually 4 prisons. It's the one that everybody knows about where I am. There's a higher security prison, CSP SAC, that's just like 800 yards down the road. There's a women's prison, and there is a minimum security camp. But the women's prison here is a outward transition prison. In other words, it's where they send you right before you get released. So it wouldn't be practical for me to start a program in this particular women's prison because they're here only temporarily. It's a little harder for me to set up one in a women's prison. It took 95% of my job is asking people to break rules or make new rules. The idea that I have a Zoom connection from one prison to another where men incarcerated in one prison can actually interact live with men in a different prison was a tremendous, tremendous coup. It would be almost impossible for me to get the prison system to allow male inmates and female inmates to interact. So I would really have to run a program in parallel. I would like to do that. I'm pitching this program to another department on my campus to create a second bachelor's degree. And in the future, I'd like to offer a master's degree. But you got to crawl before you can walk. So, but yeah, women's prison would be fantastic and wonderful and needed. It's not fair that they don't have this opportunity.
Yeah. Thank you, Dave. I just wanted to I am just in awe, and it's such a beautiful image thinking of someone in Folsom prison carrying EPO full of notes and folded pages, just like everyone else in the Gebserian society tends to do. It's a really beautiful image, and again, it's very inspiring what you're doing. I think the questions that were already asked were kind of along the lines I was going to ask you about. What is meaningfully, what about Gebser is meaningfully engaging them in their life, helping them, and actually maybe the other side of this is you're saying it's effective and it's working and it's being well received. I'm kind of wondering how the institution is receiving Gebser, right? Like, how are they interpreting, or what are the metrics and gauges they're seeing in prisoners that check this project off and say, this is good, this is what we like to see?
Well, obviously, prisons are all about the status quo, right? And peace and quiet. And so and I'm going to talk in prison talk now, not TOPS talk. If inmates do their program and they behave, that's success. That's the metric that they use, right? Inmates doing their program and not being in trouble. And so I think whatever I would do or anybody in any program would do is irrelevant to the leadership of the prison, so long as the results are, in their own terms, inmates are doing their programming and staying quiet. But not only was Ken Spencer, whom some of you met, the principal here at Fulsom, because there's an adult school that kind of coordinates what I'm doing. Not only is he amazingly supportive, but the warden of this prison is supportive. To allow Michael Love to come on Zoom on this computer, which he's not allowed to use because this is a staff computer, and talk to all of you out in the world, it had to be approved by the principal, by the warden, and by CDCR headquarters at the state level. So there are some people who might not really grasp exactly what we're doing, but are really supportive of what we're doing. Susan Clark says, we have successful poetry programs in the Nevada prisons for many years. Do I think that overt discussion and intellectual framework from Gebser helps potentiate awareness that we all hope can arise? I think so. And I think when you hear how Love put Gebserian terms into the prison experience, you'll see that. It's undeniably a Gebserian poem. So, and are there any offerings in mindfulness? Not yet. Hopefully soon. But right now, we're in the very early building stages, which is a good thing because I don't have to undo the program, that I inherited. I will read one quick sentence because the program that I inherited had a mission statement, and it wasn't written by a Gebserian, but it was a very Gebserian mission. The program is grounded in the values of access, integrity, positive self-awareness, and humanitarianism. So to bring Gebser into that really wasn't, changing everything, but it was enhancing things. So, go ahead.
Dave, to draw on one of your early topics about the importance of, you said a name, but I'm going to expand it to all language. The work of a couple of, I think, Stanford researchers, Thibodeau and Boroditsky, on the use of metaphor. One of their early studies, they looked at the difference between calling crime a beast or a virus.
Mm-hmm.
And they got people to say, well, read this thing about crime in your city and tell us how you would respond to it. And the people that got the paragraph that had the word beast responded with, catch it, kill it, basically how you would respond to a beast. And the people who got the paragraph that said crime is a virus said things along the lines of, heal it, transform, they followed the metaphor. And I think it would be really cool to get the people in the prison for whom these metaphors are not just ways of speaking, but they affect their entire life.
They do.
To get them to be the ones to start changing the metaphors.
It would be nice. It's a hard sell, and so I have a faculty orientation and I have a student orientation. And in the faculty orientation, I'm actually bringing in Gebser and Gebserian theory so that no matter what my professors are teaching, no matter what courses they're teaching, and they have a class in geography, they have a class in the philosophy of art, they have criminal justice class in landmark Supreme Court cases, rhetoric. It doesn't matter. The professors, I'm teaching the professors sort of the crash course in Gebser as it pertains to this program, so that they understand the mentality that I expect of them. I'm planning on reaching out to the custody staff because I feel like if I could get the key players in the custody staff in each prison on board, then they would stop seeing us as yet another goofy, bleeding heart liberal thing, and see us as partners in this corrections and rehabilitation effort. But it's difficult because we are, we exist in time and space and circumstance and politics. And Jesse said, is there funding so each student can have a copy of Jeremy's book? Yeah, probably. I could probably buy enough copies of Jeremy's book. I know the publisher. I could probably get a cut rate if I bought in bulk.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just thinking of, I personally think that each one of those 40 students should have a copy of Jeremy's book so they can write in it. And, I mean, I'll be in touch with you, but I think it's, goodness gracious, it sounds like it's an important facet of everything.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And somebody was speaking.
I was, but I just remuted. I just wanted to, explore that with you.
No, I think it's a great idea.
Okay. I'll be in touch about it.
Thank you. And Jeremy said he would love to hear personal comments and reflections from the students. This is inspiring. If I can, Michael Love's poem is really short. And so I might ask him if he wouldn't mind sharing some reflections, if he'd be comfortable with that. But I'll tell you one thing that he said to me months ago. He said, living in prison is like being in a trash can. He said, every so often somebody lifts the lid and you get to see the sky and you get to smell the fresh air. And then without warning, that lid comes crashing down again. He said, you folks from Sac State are the only people, and I found out subsequently, by the way, he's been in prison since 1987. He says, you folks from Sac State are the only people who have reached into the trash can to pull us out. Another one of my students who's been in prison for 22 years said to me, you told us that we could go to grad school. What's that? Like, what could I do? And how do I get there? This is a grown man who's been in prison for decades. Now he's talking about grad school, and I had one who released about 4 weeks ago, after 40 years in prison, 61 years old, been in prison for 40 years, released, and he's on parole. And he said to me that it's really hard. It's really hard after so many years in prison to be free. He said, I'm trying to learn how to be free. And he said, but I'm thinking about the way that I have to be aperspectival because my perspective was so shaped by inmate identity. And I mean, look, do these guys, could they write a dissertation about Gebser on the level that we would expect right now of a PhD student? Of course not, right? But I think it's an amazing victory that I have a 61-year-old guy who's been in prison for 40 years who uses the word aperspectival. I feel like that's an accomplishment right there. And they're going to get it on whatever level they get it. But these reflections mean a lot. The idea that they can say, I never thought about a graduate degree. Now I am. That's incredible. That's transformative. So, yeah, Misha says the problem is that the state officials are contaminated with the virus of crime and commit multiple crimes themselves, crimes of violence. Yeah, and we are responsible. And that's why it's rule number one in this program that these are students. And that we refer to them as students. And I personally refer to them as Mr., or in the case of my trans student, Ms., Mr. Smith, Ms. Johnson, because nobody does that around here. They're just called by their last name. And the institution, so much of institutional life is about dehumanizing. And if there's anything that Gebser really tried to emphasize, it's the humanity of all of us. And that if we're going to be integral, we have to be the most human and interact with other humans in the most human way. And so it's such a simple thing to just call them Mr. or Ms. but no one does. Or to thank them, or to say, excuse me, or to admit that I made a mistake. You know, these things never happen. And so it's shocking to them. And so we had a big disagreement in class the other day, and they were really nervous that they're telling me that they think I'm wrong. But I said, this is marvelous. This is what a university classroom is supposed to be. This is what a meeting of the minds is supposed to be. We don't have to agree. We just have to disagree in a way that doesn't dehumanize each other. And I felt like that was one of those inspiring moments. It's a really cool job. I work like 10 hours a day, 6-7 days a week. I'm never tired because it's a really energizing thing to do. And as I coast to the finish line of my career, 3 years, 10 months, and 7 days, 6 days, I hope that this is where I finish because it's really a marvelous thing. So that's what I've got.
Any final questions? No? Okay. Why don't we take a quick break? 5 minutes. So come back at 8 after the hour and we'll transition to some poetry and performance stuff.
Already?
Okay?
No.